Welcome. It's great to have you here. This is a webinar on perspectives on humanitarian development coherence and education. My name is s.Nicolai, and I'm a senior research fellow at the Overseas Development Institute. I worked last year with a number of colleagues that you'll hear from soon on a white paper on education and humanitarian development coherence. This was commissioned by the USAID Education in Crisis and Conflict Network, or ECCN, and with an intended audience of US government staff, as well as staff particularly in USAID missions, the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, and the Office of Transition Initiatives. And you'll hear from folks representing those groups soon. It was also commissioned with an intended audience of partners working with the US government. The issue of education in crisis is an incredibly important one. It's partly important due to the scale of the need. Over 250 million children, or 1 in 10, live in areas affected by armed conflict. And more than half of the world's 65 million refugees are children. In addition, there's 50 million girls and boys who are affected by disasters. So the scale of the need is great. There's an incredible challenge in terms of education for many of those children, in terms with particular challenges in terms of resourcing and support, where governments themselves don't have enough resourcing to be providing and ensuring education, and often a long history of disconnect across both the humanitarian and the aid community in terms of how resourcing is allocated and married up. So there's real challenges in terms of coherence and coordination. Which means that many children fall through the gaps in terms of their education. It's a key moment in time now in terms of the possibility to address some of that. With Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals having highlighted the importance of education across all communities and the importance of leaving no one behind, there's a particular opportunity within the development space to be focusing much more on fragility and crisis. Alongside that has been the World Humanitarian Summit and the emphasis on humanitarian development coherence as a policy priority, which has been operationalized partly through things like the new ways of working. So it's a really important moment now. It was incredible to have a chance to work with USAID and across the US government to understand more about the different agencies that are delivering education in crisis, and to learn about how they are working together and where there would be greater opportunities to do so in order to bridge some of those gaps that exist. So it has been a really interesting piece of work. I'm going to turn now to introduce some of the other panelists and the format that we're going to use today. So today you're going to hear first from 3 different representatives of the major agencies that we were working with to look at their responses to education in crisis and how they were working together. And then we'll be moving to 2 representatives to talk about case studies and what this actually looks like in the field in a particular country, in Yemen and South Sudan. And then we'll be turning to 2 different experts where they will share their work with the Global Partnership for Education and with Education Cannot Wait in terms of the funding and financing that is trying to be used to address education and coherence. So I will turn now to the one other thing I should say is that on the bottom of your screen there is a place for Q&A, for questions and answers. So as we go through the presentations, please go ahead and log some of those questions that come to your mind already. I will be watching those, and at the end of the presentations, we'll be turning to a moderated session of Q&A with the presenters. So I will turn it over now to Nina Papadopoulos with USAID to give an overview of the problem and the conceptual framework that was introduced in the paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. So thank you. Good morning, everyone, from warm Washington, D.C. This is a really exciting piece of work that we did, and it actually is something that helped the U.S. government come together more holistically around the importance of education and protection for children and young people in crisis and conflict. And Susan did mention there is a growing challenge of conflict, crisis, and protected emergencies across the world. Approximately 75 million people require humanitarian assistance, and displacement has reached record levels. Humanitarian emergencies have become more complex, urbanized, and protracted, and typically include multiple simultaneous stresses and shocks from climate-related hazards, conflict, and criminal violence, including other aspects like forced displacement and pandemics. They have also become more protracted, with an average length of displacement due to conflict reaching about 17 years. Hard-won development gains are set back enormously by crisis and disasters. And it's this recognition that I think really forced us as a U.S. government to dig deep and to look inside how we were responding to ensure that children and young people got the education support that they needed across the spectrum from relief to development. At the same time, we realized that USAID was spending more and more money in crisis and conflict-affected environments. And we really had to think critically about what were the tools that we had in order to ensure that the responses that we were funding and financing were linked to our previous humanitarian work, but also the programs we were designing were able to sort of go back and forth and not be as rigid as our traditional development programs in stable contexts. We feel that as a consequence of what's going on, humanitarian and development communities are increasingly challenged to be fit for purpose in these environments. So what I'm going to talk about today is, with the problem that led us to this work, and then a very important conceptual framework that we were able to put together, within the U.S. government, and then some important and actionable recommendations that came out of this work. So what we're hoping to get on the screen is the conceptual framework. And really the first thing we did with this work was we tried to look more broadly about around what does coherence look like in the education sector. A lot of documentation up until this point has been about broad coherence between humanitarian development actors. And as an education sector, we really wanted to unpack that and drill down and have some very explicit actions that we could take within the education sector, and also to help us understand how to know if we were actually doing it right. So, for example, doing education coherence. If you have a chance to look at the paper, on page 30, you'll see a conceptual framework that outlines what are some opportunities for education coherence more broadly. And what you'll see here are three rows, and we talk about coherence in terms of norms. So what guides education support? The capacities. So who leads and coordinates the support to education? And then the operations. How education support is planned and provided. And we hope that this framework is helpful to any actor in this space to help to unpack for the education sector. So, for example, what we see, just taking the operations as an example. So, one of the opportunities for coherence, we can see joint education needs assessments. So, joint meaning both joint within the sector, but also bringing together the humanitarian development actors to do joint assessments. Another area that's an opportunity is looking at linking the emergency education provision to formal education systems. So taking a sort of a longer view in terms of linking humanitarian assistance and education to either formal systems or more longer term work. So we hope you find this framework helpful. What we were able to do with this general framework is then, working with Susan and her team, we were able to apply it to the US government. So the next slide that you should be able to see talks about applying coherence, particularly within the US government. And I just want to draw your attention to a few aspects of this as well. So here we can see the framework applied to the work we do in the US government. This is where we're able to dig deeper into the framework and identify clear and realistic steps to improve coherence in the education sector. And at this point, I want to draw your attention to a few key points that will be reinforced throughout the webinar by some of our other speakers. In the operations row, we see the encouraging joint investments in partners where there are shared interests. And a good example of how we've been able to make progress on this relates to USAID and the State Department's joint work to support ECW. That's one example. Another good example that we have in the opportunities for coherence is integrating risk reduction and preparedness into education planning and programming. We've increasingly been able to carry out education risk analysis in countries in order to get a good sense of where we should be providing investments, and also providing us with some data that we can assess on an ongoing basis and check to see if our assumptions were correct or if we need to pivot our work. And then another important part of these opportunities for coherence include enabling more adaptive planning and programming to allow for pivots and greater flexibility of education funding. And we're going to see that in the Yemen example as well. So I just wanted to make sure that these frameworks are available, and I hope that they're useful for a variety of actors. And it's been a really helpful step for us to actually figure out how we can work together within the US government to improve coherence. And finally, another sort of very important piece of the work that we did with ODI here were a set of recommendations that came out. And the recommendations are very closely linked to the framework that we just shared with you. So I just want to share a few of the recommendations that we found really helpful. And so one of the most important ones was strengthening high-level US government support for education in emergencies and protracted crisis. I think that this is something that we really appreciate this as a recommendation, and we have this as a call to action to all actors in this space. We have seen an enormous progress and interest in this issue, and we want to encourage other actors in this space to continue to approach their high-level officials to support this. It's sort of a bottom down and a top up approach that we find really important. I'm going to move on to a few other of the important recommendations that we found. This next one that I want to highlight is invest in understanding and defining the links between education and resilience. Resilience is something that has become a quite important concept within the US government, and especially within USAID. And what we're finding is that there are very obvious links between education and resilience, and identifying education coherence in humanitarian development coherence has actually helped us to give more thought to the links between education and resilience. Another important recommendation is to develop tools, capacity, and mechanisms to support efforts by the US government and partners in strengthening humanitarian development coherence and related knowledge management. And that's an important recommendation that we're able to take on as well. Finally, the last recommendation that I want to draw your attention to is around ensuring that education sector assessments has an approach that considers coherence in the collection and analysis of primary and secondary data. And this is something that I think there's been a lot of progress on in the last few years. The education cluster plays a very important role in countries, And to the extent that development actors can lean into that work and ensure that the data that's collected is helpful for both short, medium, and longer term goals. And I hope that that's just enough to give you a taste of this work, and it helps to draw your attention to this paper and the frameworks, and that you are able to use those and customize them for your particular context. I would now like to turn the discussion over to my colleague from the State Department, the Bureau for Population, Refugees, and Migration, Anna Nicole.
Great, thank you so much, Nina. Let me see. Great, so again, my name is Anna Nicole, and I work at the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration at the State Department. And I work specifically on our policy team on the issue of humanitarian development coherence, and I do not come at this necessarily with an education background. And so I'm going to start a little bit with kind of the broader picture of how education might fit into the State Department and USAID and the broader USG's approach to humanitarian development coherence. As we've mentioned, this is definitely a priority within the US government right now. So we're excited to have this opportunity to talk to you a little bit about where this fits in. So I wanted to start a little bit with kind of what humanitarian development coherence is, to kind of lay the groundwork and build a little bit off of what Nina has just told you. And so essentially, if you take anything away from a definition of what it is, it's really about shared outcomes. And in order to achieve those shared outcomes, we really need to engage in joint planning and needs analysis between our humanitarian partners and our development partners. And so what does this look like on the ground? This could look like many different pieces. This could be a joint mapping exercise between humanitarian and development partners, identifying what sectors need to be strengthened, where the gaps are in the different populations that we're reaching. This could also look like coordinated strategic planning. And so if you're working at USAID, for example, in a mission, this is a great opportunity to invite your humanitarian colleagues to the table and contribute, for example, to the country development coordination strategy, or if you work at the State Department, vice versa. So involve all of the parties into your strategic planning. And this could also look a lot like engaging host country government. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this and give some examples of where this has really worked well. And so a little bit about the why as well. From the humanitarian's perspective, we've really noted that we need to stretch our joint reach and our impact. And you can see the graphs at the bottom. The one on the left shows funding, and the lighter gray bar actually shows what funding needs have been according to UN-OCHA across the UN system. And the darker bar shows actually what has been provided. And so you can see there's a very large wedge, and that wedge is only growing. And on the right, you can see a graph that shows the actual number of displaced population. And so this is a little bit outdated too. And so that displaced population has only grown since 2017 into 2018. Second, another important why is to better address the long-term needs of forcibly displaced persons. So today we're seeing even more protracted situations. And so these individuals, they're not being displaced for 3 to 4 months. These people are being displaced on average for about 10 years. And so we need to move beyond thinking about how do we feed these people and how do we get them water. We also need to think about how do we make sure that their lives aren't on hold. And that this is particularly pertinent, I think, for the education sector. So that we can continue those much needed education needs for those children. And then finally, another important why is really to cement development gains, because of course, whenever large populations are going to be flowing into a new location, that's going to have impacts on the local population. And so we're taking a much more comprehensive approach to make sure that we're thinking about both the displaced population, but also those communities that are hosting them, because we don't want any sort of backsliding on the development gains that have already been made. So this slide is really to just kind of cement what I was talking about those strong connections between displacement issues and development. And these two slides actually were taken from the World Bank. So this is really to just show that communities that are displaced are in communities where we already have and are usually providing pretty significant development assistance. And this is particularly true, I think, of refugee situations. So on the next slide. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the specific imperative of using the humanitarian development coherence in the education sector. And really, I just want to highlight that those in the education sector, I think, have really been at the forefront of using humanitarian development coherence. And in part, there's been this recognition that there has been this very significant gap in reaching children in crisis contexts. And so on one side, you have those who are providing humanitarian assistance, who by nature, they often have to prioritize meeting those basic needs. And there's just not enough funding, I think, to meet those medium to long-term needs. And then on the other side, you have those who are providing development assistance, who are often located in areas of good governance, or they don't want to step on the toes of those providing humanitarian assistance. And so this leaves a natural gap between the humanitarian assistance and the development assistance, I think, that really humanitarian development coherence fills. So there's a lot of opportunities, I think, for engaging in humanitarian development coherence. There's significant complementary comparative advantages that both the humanitarian actors and development actors bring to the table for education, and achieve those collective outcomes. So if we move on to the next slide and to talk about PRM specific work in education. So again, we are the Humanitarian Bureau of the State Department, and we provide protection. We ease suffering, and we resolve the plight of persecuted and forcibly displaced people around the world. And so we do this through multiple ways. Most of our assistance is provided through our international organization partners. And so most of that is through UNHCR and UNICEF, but we also provide programs through NGO programs, and Education Cannot Wait, which you're going to hear more about later today. And so the actual assistance includes provision of school materials, construction and rehabilitation of schools, and support for teachers. We also make sure to facilitate access of refugee children to local education facilities, which includes transportation and enrollment. And we do prioritize quality education alongside comprehensive protection assistance, because protection is really the mandate of the international organizations that we work primarily with. And I think Melissa is going to speak a little bit more about the protection piece of it as well. So I wanted to provide you with a couple of examples of humanitarian development coherence in action from one of our primary partners, UNHCR. So there has been a growing consensus that inclusion of refugees into national education systems is the most sustainable and equitable approach to providing education to refugees. Creation of parallel systems has really created significant challenges, including kind of lack of access of certification and examinations for refugees. And since 2017, Kenya has really recognized the need for greater responsibility sharing. And this has really been exemplified in their work in Kakuma refugee camp, where they have registered 26 camp-based primary schools with the Ministry of Education. So that's been a really good example of the work that they've been doing. I also want to flag the Accelerated Education Working Group, which has been led by UNHCR and other partners who work in accelerated education programs. And this aims to improve accelerated education programs through developing guidance and tools that support a more harmonized and more standardized approach to accelerated education. There's been other really good examples of government engagement on refugee inclusion, in addition to the Kenya example that I just provided. I'm not going to go through all of those, but Chad, Rwanda, Turkey have all made good progress in this space. And then finally, I wanted to note a couple of the global policy movements that have really driven this discussion forward. And that includes the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, the CRRF, which has this vision of really including refugees into communities from the onset of a crisis. And so that includes engaging with host governments, that includes engaging significantly with our development partners. Where can development partners step in earlier so that we can think about these medium to long-term needs? And so the CRF has really been a critical component of driving forward increased education opportunities for displaced communities. And then I also wanted to mention the Nairobi Declaration, which as of April 2018, really commits to making education systems in Africa more inclusive of refugees and IDPs. And these are just a couple of examples of many, many policy movements that we've been seeing recently. So if we move on to the next slide. So a couple of specific opportunities and challenges that we're seeing for humanitarian development coherence in the education sector. Again, it's a great opportunity to kind of lean on some development actors that have traditionally not worked in areas of fragility and conflict and violence, and working with particularly displaced populations. And so this includes the World Bank, This includes many different partners that we've really been thankful that they've stepped into this space. But I think, of course, there's always more that can be done. And so we're always excited to engage more with more development partners. And again, shared outcomes are very easy to identify, I think, specifically in this space. And I've mentioned a lot of those. And then challenges, I think, bringing education up to standard. This has been a challenge. I know someone was telling me about this in Uganda, specifically where refugees from the Congo, they were used to a higher standard of education when they came into Uganda, and then we work with the Ugandan government to make sure that we're bringing those kind of standards back up so that we meet kind of a more equitable level of education for everyone. The issue of curriculum and language can really be a challenge. Which do you use, the host country, or do you use the country of origin, particularly when refugee situations are really protracted? The best practice now is really to use the host country curriculum and language for the most part, but often there is a reticence from the host country because this could signal integration, which gets a little bit dicey. Certification, of course, is always going to be a challenge. They may be allowed to go to schools, but they may not be allowed to take final exams, which is always challenging. Funding, I think, is always very, very challenging. As I've mentioned, humanitarian actors often have to prioritize meeting basic needs, and so this leaves a gap. And development donors do not always see that clear link, I think, between the development and crisis contexts, specifically in meeting the needs of refugees and other displaced communities. And finally, I do want to mention that often we face a lack of an evidence base for what works, how it works, and for whom, and at what cost. And so, of course, we're always pushing for a stronger evidence base to support a lot of this. And I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague at USAID, Melissa Horn-Albuja.
Thank you. Great. Good morning. Again, my name is Melissa Horn-Albuja, and I'm the lead sector advisor for the protection team at the Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance within USAID. Relief development coherence is a top priority for OFDA and has been for many years, as has been stated by my colleagues. And in all of our conversations and discussions surrounding our need to work more closely with development colleagues, we've really prioritized ensuring that protection is central to these conversations and to our response. For our own programs within OFDA, we require that all of our partners, no matter the sector, mainstream protection. In other words, ensuring that the assistance and activities that are being implemented are safe, that they're accessible, and they meet the unique needs of the most vulnerable populations, including children. So child protection and education are both key components to ensuring the protection of vulnerable children. So this is definitely a natural sector for us to work on the relief development coherence agenda. And contrary to the common misperception, OFDA does actually fund education and emergency programming and considers these interventions to be integral to the protection of children. There's a direct linkage, as we've said, between objectives of child protection of those of education and emergencies, chiefly safeguarding or ensuring a child's physical, emotional, and intellectual well-being. So OFDA's role in education for IDPs is to address and mitigate the critical protection risks for children. Often this is accomplished through discrete education activities as a part of a more holistic child protection program, which aims at having a protective learning environment. So we work together with our E3 colleagues to ensure the integration of education and protection programming in a way that addresses the critical risks faced by children in emergencies, that contributes to the immediate response activities, but as Nina was saying, also looks at sustaining education through medium and longer term solutions. So I want to give a little bit of background on the protection needs of children in crises and a little bit about OFDA's work on child protection and how those jointly working with child protection and education actors can lead to stronger outcomes for both sectors. So as was hinted to earlier by a number of speakers, children, particularly internally displaced and refugee children, face significant protection issues and risks in all humanitarian crises. These include many types of life-threatening risks, including exposure to extremely traumatic events, abduction and recruitment to military recruitment, abuse, neglect, exploitation, and all forms of physical, sexual, and emotional violence. These disasters can have lifelong effects on children beyond the child's immediate survival and threaten their future in terms of physical and mental health, their educational achievement, and their relationships with others. So OPTA supports child protection programs aimed at to ensure that children are safe in their communities. And we do this by supporting community-based child protection mechanisms, child-friendly spaces and safe healing and learning, and child protection case management, and family tracing and reunification for unaccompanied and separated children and for children who are formerly associated with armed actors. So as I mentioned earlier, OPTA also supports education as a part of our child protection interventions. For example, we would support temporary adapted learning opportunities, psychosocial support, which we think is critical for children, for their parents, and for their teachers in crisis-affected communities. And perhaps another example is light school repairs or school supplies to help displaced children be able to access school. So up on here on the screen, you have a few more of the activities. So as Nicole was just saying, we really believe that shared outcomes are important, and that integrating child protection and education leads to better outcomes in both sectors, and it creates a mutually reinforcing cycle that can reduce children's vulnerability in emergencies. We know that quality education programs help connect children and adolescents with critical social services where they are able to access other forms of protection assistance, services, and support. And then also, effective and holistic child protection programming can help children manage stress, develop coping skills, connect better with friends and teachers, and improve educational outcomes and support increased access to education. So it's really important for us to be working together to have these joint outcomes. I'm going to give one kind of example of this. So as we know, protection risk can exist in school as well as outside of school, including school-related gender-based violence, sexual exploitation and abuse, or bullying. So it's essential for child protection and education actors to identify and proactively address those risks to create a safe and inclusive school. Personnel in the school must understand the need for child protection and to provide a protective environment that is also supportive, particularly for vulnerable populations such as adolescent girls, children with disabilities, and other marginalized children who face particular risks either within or outside of school. And a good example of that is children who are formerly associated with armed actors. These children, we can see that education is a critical opportunity to help with their reintegration. That can only happen if the school is safe and inclusive and allows them to flourish. So really just stressing the need for both education and child protection actors to be working on these joint protection outcomes for children. So as we've mentioned, I think, and have noted, there's agreement across both the child protection and education community that we should be working better together. We've been doing this, I think, at the global level since 2013 with some joint annual meetings between INEE and the Child Protection Working Group or the Alliance. We've also seen good practice in many contexts on collaboration between education and child protection actors, such as in the DRC Kasai response in 2017, where they developed a joint strategy between the child protection and education on the response in the Kasai for children. Yet, even though there's agreement and we have some good practice, we haven't been able to systematically build better coherence in our programming from the onset of an emergency. And here are some of the few challenges that I wanted to go through to what hinders us from having better coherence consistently. The first is that development education programs are not always taking place in the same location where we see humanitarian needs in a country. The second is pivoting or changing development programs to address humanitarian needs takes significant time compared to the rapidly changing humanitarian needs and response. The third is that, as Nicole has already mentioned, is that emergency response places an emphasis on service delivery for those most in need, while development places an emphasis on capacity building and system strengthening. And then the last is that longer-term education programming and activities aren't always fit for purpose in terms of what crisis-affected children need in terms of protection and education supports in emergency, such as psychosocial support, temporary education shelters, or replacement textbooks. So I wanted to end this with some possible opportunities or way forward for better coherence that came out of my recent visit to Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, we've seen that the conflict has spread throughout the country and has increasingly impacted development programming, including our robust education sector programming in Ethiopia. Our education development colleagues have been able to adapt some of their programming. However, gaps remain both in terms of their ability to deliver development assistance or achieve development objectives and goals, and meeting the needs of the humanitarian needs. So we learned from our TDY and conversations with our mission colleagues that good practice is, as Nina was saying, that education and child protection actors need to be talking closely from the early onset and need to be engaging in the cluster system. So in this context, we saw that child protection actors had a stronger understanding of the emergency response, were engaging in the cluster system, and had a better understanding of the needs of children. However, the education actors, while they weren't engaging in that process, had stronger relationships with the government, given the historical restrictions that we saw in Ethiopia with being able to implement protection programming. And so really, together, child protection actors and education actors needed to come together to be able to share information, do as Nina said, have joint assessments, be developing joint messaging, and look for opportunities or synergies in their programming. If the government was allowing for education programming to take place, then child protection actors needed to use that opportunity to see what kind of protection activities could be supported through the education programming to meet both the protection and education needs of children in this conflict. So perhaps it's because OFDA does a lot of disaster risk reduction work that I think a real opportunity for better coherence is to build in flexibility into development awards from the onset of the project. Crisis modifiers, or the equivalent, I think should be included on almost every award, particularly in countries where we know that there are either natural disasters, conflicts, or the potential for these, which is in most of the places that we're operating. So for the crisis modifiers, I think that development actors need to be thinking about how to build in flexibility in terms of location. So giving space for them to need to pivot to areas around where they're providing their traditional development programming. The type of additional humanitarian assistance, protection, or education programming that they could include, such as additional psychosocial support or social emotional learning programming, or temporary learning spaces, or helping kids with books that might have been lost in either the floods or hurricanes, etc. And then the last is on targeting beneficiaries. As Nicole was just saying, if there's an influx of refugees or if there's an influx of displaced populations, how they can be expanding their beneficiary population or the group of individuals that their development program is serving in order to meet the needs of those conflict-affected children.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Nina, Anna, and Melissa for your perspectives. It really is interesting in terms of looking at how you are approaching and engaging in education from agencies that have very different mandates and focus. And I think there's a lot of details and thinking in the paper, but some of the things that you presented are things we'll probably return back to in the Q&A. What we are going to do now is to turn to several colleagues who represent how this looks in practice in a country where there are education and crisis needs. So first I will turn to Steph Kendall, who's from USAID and will be talking about Yemen.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Susan. And thank you all for joining us. This really is a terrific experience, considering that together we're one of the most important lines of defense for kids in conflict and crisis. So that said, here's a look at the first slide I thought I'd present to you is what's been shared by the Humanitarian response plan for Yemen writ large that's disseminated every January as a lead up really of the most important needs in the context. And I thought I'd present this so that you could really see how interwoven development and humanitarian responses are within the context of Yemen. So as we look at this, we just want to make sure that you note that it's not just what we're really talking about with coherence, but what we're really also looking at in this discussion and through these case studies is to understand more deeply the leverage of the reliance of humanitarian support and development support, and what we're talking about there, regardless of funding stream, and how the two need to really scaffold one another moving forwards. And I will be referring to the words of Anna and also to Melissa and Nina as we move through this to bolster really the way that we do it as well. So as we look through this and we coordinate as a donor group and as a leg group, you'll note that we coordinate very carefully along all lines, and oftentimes not one donor will take control of one activity, but rather we're sharing activities and supporting those activities according to geography. So mapping is extraordinarily important, and especially in a complex environment as Yemen, where North and South, we have to coordinate the government there as well. So there's a lot going on, and I look forward to letting you know next about what USAID is doing. So here's USAID's approach to education in Yemen. We're really looking at first the whole child and making sure that they've got food in their bellies. And that's where the school feeding program comes in for World Food Program. It's no secret, obviously, that kids are on the brink of starvation or worse in Yemen, especially in the northern 4 governorates where we are operating. And that funding, because of our earmark, to refer back to Susan on funding, the basic education earmark only just recently allowed school feeding. So this project is funded with Democracy and Governance and Economic Growth Funds. So that took a little bit of internal dancing, we'll call it, to make sure that we met all of the programmatic elements so that kids were receiving school feeding. From there, I'll be moving, if we move straight up to the light purple spot, I'm hoping you can read this. It's a bit small font. We have the 2 projects. One is in procurement, and one is active now with Save the Children and IRC on second chance and social support. And that's to make sure that we're reaching the 2.2 out of school kids and bringing them back into the mainstream through non-formal and accelerated learning programs. And that's also split evenly across North and South, and that was very deliberate. We have to be extraordinarily cautious in a context like Yemen on where we operate. And then moving clockwise, the darker purple spot, that we've got safe spaces and back to school preparation, UNICEF, the School Doors Project, and the project to be released. And that ensures also making sure that schools are up to par as far as rebar sticking out of a playground goes, and wash services and actual desks to sit in as well. And that's something that we're funding through UNICEF. So you'll note, and the last 2 remaining circles, it's a lot of support to UNICEF to make sure that we actually had the groundwork, the humanitarian elements covered as far as safe spaces to gather, teachers who knew how to handle PSS and SEL issues, as well as were able to refer kids to social workers if there were dire straits involved there. So that essentially is our approach to Yemen as far as education goes, and one that we bear in mind in order to make sure that our programming is as balanced as possible, attends to the needs of the child protection elements, as noted by Melissa, and also ensures that we have openings and areas where we can plug in development activities as we move forwards, or retract those if we need to then pivot and focus more on humanitarian response. So the next slide really is on practices in a context like this that I found really valuable. And essentially it's about coordination and flexibility. And I can't stress this enough. The coordination element with the donor partner group and the local education group, specifically with GPE, ECW. For Yemen, we are led on the donor partner group and led right now by UNESCO. UNICEF is a constant there, so as is GIZ. WFP, the World Food Program, is also present and a very strong partner. Now, in Yemen, we have what we call the Transition Education Plan, and that's obviously GPE's MO. And this is, it's in the works, it's negotiated pretty constantly and down to the last line. And that's something I think that really assists us to provide a super ego as we move forwards, especially as we coordinate with the government in Yemen. So that's an important piece to bear in mind, is that the government needs to chime in, and that can often create an important negotiation point and build trust across all actors as well as the government itself. I think another element is to bear in mind is that coordination practices are not monolithic, because no context is the same and no context remains the same. So what do? We make sure that we are leveraging the times of peace, periods of peace, and understanding that safety comes first when conflict erupts. So this, I think, is very important. When it comes down to coordination across the board, internally and externally, really what the purposes are to triangulate the data, make sure we're reducing duplication as much as possible, as well as strengthening the donor, implementer, and ROIG relations as much as possible. There can often be a lot of stop and start based on the conflict and the context in general. So we lean on implementers, and we lean on those on the ground to receive information as much as possible on a daily basis, as their time allows, of course. So that's really essentially how we handle the coordination elements. And then the flexibility is built into the programming, as Melissa noted, with regard to humanitarian and development work. So moving on. So in terms of the flexibility to pivot, we do build flexibility into the specific interventions, and that requires pretty nuanced knowledge of the technical details and the viability of each shift in the course in terms of phasing, etc. But it also requires heeding the political timber of the country. It's not just that the context will shift, the political timber may well shift as well, and paying attention to that. So triangulation on all those points is extraordinarily critical. So that's where the Transition Education Plan is a very helpful framework, so that we can adhere to that even when the context requires an awful lot of pivoting and flexibility. On point number 2, we try to devise a means to address every critical element of the in-country needs. So it doesn't have to be, everything doesn't have to be held in one project. We can have one project focused on the school feeding, another on administrative support. It'd be wonderful if we could come up with some gorgeous program that would do everything, but obviously it won't. And then coordinating that along the lines with our other donors at the donor group. And I think another important point to make there is on Yemen, we meet every 6 months or more frequently as a donor group itself. So I just show up. I think showing up, whether it's virtual, whether the line is good or bad, whether the line drops, just be in the conversation is really vital to building the relationships and setting a course. And on point 3, the donors are able to work with implementers on the targets, be they timeline, political navigation, and budget maneuvering, etc. There's a lot of backshop that happens as far as budget goes that I think is also very important for us internally to bear in mind in these contexts where pipelines might not burn down as rapidly as we like, or etc. Now, in terms of rules of thumb that I like to bear in mind is Maslow first and then Bloom. Keep the kids safe and then build up their education foundation. And that it's not a straight line. You'll probably have to pivot back and forth or toggle between the two fairly frequently as far as actual focus goes. But if you think of it like music, the baseline of safety should be there even when you're focusing on the treble of Maslow. And then building relationships, keep that going, and then making sure that you are planning your work in phases, and that those phases make sense, short, medium, and long term, across the board. And I'm getting a note that I'm a little bit out of time. So what I'm going to do is pass you off now to Jane Namadi, who is my colleague at USAID in South Sudan. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Steph. Indeed, this is a phenomenal experience. I'll start off with some experiences of lessons learned from years of programming in South Sudan. And over the years, we have realized that while active violence may end in a few months, the impact of that violence actually is realized over several years, and that affects how we do programming and how we implement. And so it creates a scenario where we would find ourselves 2 steps into development and probably 3 or 5 steps still dealing with humanitarian assistance. That really has defined our response over the years. Another lesson is that the population in South Sudan is highly mobile, and they move from place to place throughout the year, and that too affects the nature and style of implementing. The more communities move, the more their ability to bounce back is reduced. And so we have to keep that in mind as we move along in programming to be able to respond appropriately. So as speakers before me mentioned, coordination and collaboration cannot be overemphasized in these kinds of situations. In South Sudan, while USAID is providing temporary learning spaces, repairs, and putting up new ones for learners who are displaced, for returning populations, and for those populations that are by nature of their lifestyle mobile, other donors are focused on supporting girls' education through capitation grants and cash transfers, leading back to learning initiatives, and mobilizing children and communities to send more children to school. So these activities actually work together to keep children in school and to provide an environment that is conducive for learning. That is a major part of collaboration that we do. Now, this is done through a number of national and USAID-based coordination structures. One of them is the Education Donor Group that brings together all the donors in country. The education cluster here is also active, and it's actually co-chaired by the Ministry of Education here in South Sudan, which brings in the involvement of the host government, defining another step towards development, while still operating in a humanitarian environment. We have a GPE steering committee and an education cannot wait task force. Frankly speaking, I think these are a little bit too many and time consuming, and in terms of coordination and demand on people. And I think that there might be a need for a restructuring to be able to coordinate in a better and more streamlined way. But so far, these structures are working. Another thing that USAID is working on here in South Sudan is the Partnership for Recovery and Resilience. So USAID is a major participant on this initiative, and it brings together UN participants, NGOs, national and international communities, faith-based organizations, traditional leaders to actually sit together and plan on what communities on how communities can be able to bounce back from any shocks that they may have experienced. We have realized collective outcomes from working together in this kind of way. The first thing we realized was that actually education alone cannot achieve it all. So working together with projects that support livelihoods, health, food, agriculture, actually creates an opportunity for shared outcomes, and these outcomes can be more sustainable when achieved in this kind of better coordinated and planned manner. Not only that, in terms of sustainability, it's not just sustaining the activity, but it also leaves embedded knowledge and skills with the communities that are beneficiaries to be able to do things at a very small scale, albeit, but that move their communities forward. In the next slide, I will talk about the context. And so, as we know, the context in crisis situations is always changing. And so in 2017, USAID South Sudan conducted the rapid education risk analysis that informed a project that followed an education in emergencies project. The findings were eye-opening to the sector, so much so that we embedded a rapid education risk analysis in this follow-on project. Although it's a limited scope, it's done on a rolling basis from 6 months to 3 months, just to inform the project and make course correction and make changes, and also bring in the issue of flexibility so that when there's changes in the context, the project can be able to pivot around and respond to areas and needs in different places. USAID also uses third-party monitors that inform project progress and changes in the context. Now, it also studies perceptions of interventions. Now, the information that comes out of these studies provides a basis for decisions to make changes or stay the course. And for this last slide, I would like to look at some models that support transition from humanitarian to development assistance. So one of the things we've learned throughout years of implementation here is that bringing child protection interventions to the school level is actually more beneficial in terms of building resilience, not just for the school, but also for communities. Setting up child-friendly centers next to the school or within the school can be better utilized than having them far away from the school, because then that means we create a competition between the child-friendly centers and the school. But if we have them in the same compound, it can be timetabled and children can be organized in a way that they can use the child-friendly center and also be able to go to class at different times of the day. Psychosocial support activities have been very important in some of the work that we do. And we are currently doing a study that actually examines the effect of the impact of psychosocial support activities on learning outcomes. It would be very interesting to see the findings coming out of that study and how much we can learn from this activity and how much we can be able to move that to the next level. We do training for local partners and teachers to facilitate psychosocial support as well in schools. Another major area I'd like to talk about that we have been working on and continue to work on is the set of criteria that qualify a school as a zone of peace. So these criteria look at areas like school safety, like school-based conflict happening at the school level. Are schools open? Are they closed? Where is this happening? Are there school-based peace activities? And are these creating some semblance of peace at the school level? How are these activities translated at the community level? And then we also look at attendance. Are children attending regularly? If they are not attending, those are signs of some red flags coming on. And a lot of other examples. Having said that, I think it's time for me to hand it back.
Great. Thanks, Jane. Thanks, Steph. I think both of your presentations were really interesting in terms of some of the themes coming across each of them, and things like the importance of flexibility and pivoting in the kind of response and particular activities that you were doing, the importance of collective outcomes and how jointly that can bring different actors together, and the importance of coordination groups, both amongst donors as well as amongst other actors, seem to be a theme that both of you highlighted. So we can come back to some of that as part of the Q&A as well. We're going to turn now to a couple experts who are representative of some of the global funds that are operational in this space, both the Global Partnership for Education and Education Cannot Wait. So first I will turn to Fazle Rabbani with GPE.
Thank you very much, Susan. I'm Fazle Rabbani. I'm a senior education specialist at the GPE Secretariat based in Washington, D.C. And I want to start by echoing the sentiment that has been expressed so far by the panelists that it's a very welcome publication, the white paper. Personally, I see this as a turning point in education aid discourse in terms of bringing the humanitarian and development aid together. And Nina has mentioned what is there in the white paper in terms of the content and the recommendations. But at the same time, I want to add to that by saying the process of developing the paper was fantastic. The way the evidence was collected, literature was reviewed, and consultation that took place among different agencies really generated discussions, thinking, and energy. And what we are seeing today is a continuation of that. So congratulations. For some reason, my screen shows I'm muted. I hope I'm heard by everyone. So it is a very timely input for GPE. I mean, we have just started a process for developing our new strategy, and we're in the middle of refining our business model. And both these internal exercises have one thing in common, and that is to make GPE more effective in humanitarian context. And we believe we can only do that by bringing in humanitarian and development actors, development and humanitarian financing and policy and other analytical tools together. And some of you already know that our tools of engagement with the country are limited. We have three main tools. One is the education sector analysis and planning guidance. The number two tool is this education sector program implementation grant, which is the biggest fund we have. And the third one is very important, which has been kind of reflected in earlier speakers' deliberations, is the local education group, which is a group that we want countries to lead, where all stakeholders, including the humanitarian stakeholders, will come and discuss education sector priorities and program priorities and submit to GP Secretariat for assessment. So that validation and endorsement process is very important for GPE, and I understand from presentations it is adding value to country level work for other agencies as well. And in that sense, GPE is actually already practicing some of the main tenets of what has been recommended in the white paper. The transitional education plan that you heard about in Yemen is one of the elements of that. This is a kind of nuanced version for humanitarian context for education sector plan development. We also have an accelerated funding facility for humanitarian situations. Through that facility, countries can access up to 20% of their main grant for addressing humanitarian situations and funding activities. 11 countries have developed transitional education plans. 5 countries so far have accessed worth about $30 million in accelerated funding facilities, and that is on the top of their regular grants, which runs into millions. And for education, local education groups, we are expanding our partnership. We have recently signed an MOU with IGAD, who are a very important player in bringing in refugees within education sector plan and planning process in Horn of Africa and East African countries. We have a very strong partnership with UNHCR. The activity that you have heard before about their success in Kakuma camp in registering schools in Kakuma and also in Kalobey settlement actually and providing textbooks, hiring teachers, and getting head teachers seconded from government services are all, I would say, a result of their being within the local education groups in Kenya and getting support from other development partners in advocating for that with the Ministry of Education. So these are very good examples. And Jane mentioned about USAID, South Sudan, and I understand there are a number of groups, but that reflects sometimes the kind of diversity of actors in a country. And different groups sometimes form their own committees, but at the same time, there is a National Education Forum, which is led by the minister. They come together in that forum and take decisions on education sector priorities. So I agree that sometimes it is a bit transaction heavy, but it delivers results. But at the same time, I totally agree. There are always ways of making those coordination more efficient and more effective. At the same time, as I said, our tools were developed for countries considering they are stable countries. The subset of those tools, the TEP, the Accelerated Funding Facility, we developed as a kind of appendix to those tools. What we want to do under this strategic planning process is to give those tools, this subset of tools, more solid policy grounding, more solid methodological and analytical grounding, so that they become full-fledged tools in their own right. So that we will identify, we will kind of acknowledge that this is a context where humanitarian and development actors must come together with all the resources and technical abilities, and these tools will help them in doing so. And for that, we'd like to remain engaged with this kind of deliberations with the agencies who want to take forward the white paper recommendations. And we definitely would like to learn from your experience. At the same time, we want to share our experience in closing the gap between humanitarian and development actors in education architecture. With that, I thank you very much, Susan, and I now hand it over to Christian from Education Cannot Wait.
Thank you, Fazle. So greetings from New York. My name is Christian Stoff. I work for Education Cannot Wait, and I'm glad to be part of this panel. This paper is very relevant to our work. We are a pooled fund receiving funding from USAID and PRM, so working with humanitarian development funding sources to work on sudden onset, escalation of crisis with humanitarian assistance programs, which we call first emergency response investments. But then we have our largest investments, which we started last year, and we have 6 of those in place in protracted crisis, which are called multi-year resilience programs. These basically are programs that run over multiple years, as the name says, basically. Offer predictable funding for partners, bring partners together with joint analysis and planning processes, and then to work with longer term results, transitioning basically towards development programs. So really working on that nexus. And in terms of results, when you look at what these multi-year resilience programs work towards this is really aligned to what is written in the paper. One is to working towards holistic learning outcomes. Oftentimes, the sudden onset crisis, the shorter term programs, the main focus on bringing students back into schools as soon as possible. But the longer term multi-year programs really have a strong learning focus in it. On the one hand, this requires quality education programs to really improve learning outcomes. This means like setting in place like adapted programs that look at catch up of students, sometimes combinations of including non-formal education service provision models that then can transition into the formal education systems. Sometimes it's really looking at the context in which children are situated. If it's hard to reach areas, whether it's community-based approaches that really need to deliver education in these situations. Sometimes you may need to actually often have additional teachers in displacement situations that to cater to the needs of additional students. You need teachers, untrained teachers, or teachers with less training to train them and to develop some minimum standards for these trainings. So all these adaptations to quality education programs are needed in these protected crisis settings, and this is what the multi-year resilience programs work towards to. Furthermore, oftentimes there's a lack of learning outcome data on what actually the children have learned, and these systems themselves need to be adapted to crisis context. Is it handling it through community-based solutions, adapting those to a multilingual setup where children are maybe coming from different communities with different languages, like Ethiopia, for example? All these require adaptations. And then also towards learning, what is important is that these children have gone through a lot of trauma and face a lot of psychosocial issues, and these sort of need to be also tackled by the teachers. So teachers need to be trained to deliver mental health psychosocial support programs, and also learning outcome measurement systems need to look at how they can measure sort of these mental health psychosocial well-being issues. May it be through a skills angle, through social emotional learning, or even like connecting to child protection services where actually mental health issues are tackled through specialized services. Then the next aspect is really protection. Safety is key. Unless you can provide safety around the learning environment, children will not attend schools. So there's a large actually connection to ensuring safety. And what we found is that communities are key actually to be facilitating that safety for students. And that is the case in Afghanistan for us, in Somalia, in South Sudan as well, where we have in investments, and CAR, for example. So to provide these safe learning environments, these multi-year resilience programs that we develop, that's a key component in those programs. Finally, the paper speaks about resilience, and this is to ensure that there's actually sustained efforts towards education provision. So the continuity in the education provision is key, and that requires also a lot of community engagement. So to have communities and school leadership really working with students and teachers and the community members to see how to prepare themselves for hazards, natural hazards, conflict-related risks, and how to adapt to those over time so that they can provide that continuity. So all these programs really have a strong angle on resilience. Finally, there's my last comment is on national resilience, and that is when it comes to IDP or refugee movements. We are having strong programs in place in Uganda, for example, in Ethiopia, that have a strong refugee focus to help actually national systems absorb and integrate refugee children, refugee teachers, and help them actually link those students and integrate them into the formal system. That in itself is a national resilience to tackling these displacements that happen too frequently in these protected crises. So looking forward to the Q&A session. One last thing is we have actually, that is what Anna said, there's a lack of understanding what works globally. We have a strong focus on systemic outcomes and enhancing the evidence of what works in those protected crises. And we have a lot of investments focused towards that based on the findings that we have from the field on these multi-year investments that we have done. Okay, that's it from my side. So I think I'm transitioning to Susan, I believe. Is that correct for the Q&A session?
Yes. Thanks, Christian, and thanks, Le. I think it was really interesting to hear about from a donor and a joint fund perspective. What are some of the mechanisms that you're using to support humanitarian development coherence, with Fazle talking a bit about GPE's support to transition plans in particular, and Christian talking about the multi-year investments that they're making as two particular examples of that. I'd like to turn now to some of the questions that have come in, both prior to the webinar being broadcast, as well as some of those that have now come in the Q&A box. So there's a number of questions we have between those two sets, and we'll turn to a few of them. The first question is, I think for Nina and Anna, if you talk a little bit about how humanitarian development coherence and education approaches, how does that differ for refugee, IDPs, and non-displaced populations? And we had a question related to this that came in now during the webcast from Salim about what's the experience of the nexus in context with government restrictions on what can be done with the refugees, such as in Cox's Bazar. So I mean, if one or the other or both of you can make a comment on that.
Sure. Are folks able to hear me right now?
Yeah.
Great. This question could be a whole nother webinar, actually, and it's a great question, and it really nails the challenges that I think all actors are facing in these contexts, because there's a variety of contexts and a variety of conditions that make coherence easier and harder. And I think that there is a difference, I think, between education where there is a refugee context, education where there is an IDP context, and then that other part of the question around host country government and refugees. I think that if the question is really around, you know, to what degree is there success in these different contexts, it is no surprise that I think that sometimes for IDP context, it's just a little easier politically to serve the needs of displaced populations. You're as donors and as sort of influencers in these countries, we have the USAID, the U.S. government has a more direct line in terms of policies and procedures, and what happens in the education system. In refugee contexts, and I'll let Anna if she wants to say something, but I actually feel like we want to punt this to Fazl a bit. He has very, very good experience in what's going on in Cox's Bazar right now, and the tricky relationship with host country government and integration of refugees. And I wonder if, Fazlia, you might say a few things about those challenges and any successes that you've seen there.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Nina. Absolutely, my kind of, I paid a visit to Cox's Bazar almost a year back, and then, of course, my colleague who's the country lead for Bangladesh is working tirelessly on making sure the children in Cox's Bazar in those camps receive at least the basic education. We have been successful in providing a grant for US $8 million through UNICEF, which is being channeled through different agencies, different NGOs, and they are working on temporary learning spaces. They have developed some kind of a curriculum and providing textbooks and other learning materials, and including teacher training for almost about 300,000 children in the camps at this. But you're absolutely right. Government is very belligerent about providing education in their mother tongue or in the local language in Cox's Bazar. And that has become the main point of, I would say, tension between development partners and the ministry in Bangladesh. We have been able to, through UNICEF and UNESCO, develop a curriculum without mentioning the language issues, a set of learning kind of outputs that we want the children to achieve in those camps temporarily. And we are providing textbooks both in Bangla and also in Rakhine and Myanmari language, so that issue about language doesn't come to the surface. So we are taking a kind of multi-pronged approach. One is developing the curriculum, making sure the learning outcomes are there, and making sure the education provided have some objectives, so that we can, at the end of the day, do some kind of assessment and show that it is providing quality education, but through different kind of modalities, through different languages, textbooks of different languages, through different kinds of teacher training. So it's a kind of joint effort. At the same time, it's not as, I would say, as structured as you'd like to see. in a situation, in a more stable situation like in Kakuma or Kalubei. But that is a reflection of the nature of the work we do in that kind of situation.
So the next question I wanted to highlight is about crisis modifiers. And I was thinking, Melissa, that you may want to say something on this because you mentioned it in your presentation. So there's a question in the Q&A asking if we can talk more specifically about what a crisis modifier is and how these modifiers are designed and implemented.
Yeah, sure. Maybe Nina, you can jump in as well. So crisis modifiers, I think, is a USAID term, and it's talking about a certain award provision language that you can have in your development assistance award that allows you to put aside a certain amount of funding for the award in the case of an emergency in the country. And so a part of that, in terms of the design process, is looking at if you have a certain amount of money available, and depending on what activities you're already going to be implementing through the award, how might you be able, what are some of the activities that you could, how could you modify some of your activities in order to meet the needs of children affected by emergencies, such as providing them with school materials, temporary learning spaces, or psychosocial support, or just some of the examples. So just going back to my example, I think it's important in context where you don't necessarily have a crisis, in the non-Yemens or Afghanistans and countries where it's mostly just development, but there could be shocks. I think reaching out to other colleagues who are working in emergency response or on child protection, it's good to have them engage in that conversation to help input into what might be appropriate activities based on whatever program you're designing. I don't know, Nina, if you want to say more.
No, that's perfect. And if folks are looking for better examples outside of the education sector, crisis modifiers started with our work on food security, and there's actually an evaluation of crisis modifiers in East Africa that Feed the Future had used. So if you want more information on that, you can find it online.
Great, thanks. Thanks both. The next question that I wanted to highlight is around coordination, and particularly support and engagement with governments on coordination. And I was wondering if either Steph or Jane might both comment on this from your own experience. And the question that's come in is really around what can be done to ensure coordination between governments, host governments, and those of refugees, and to support governments in coordination on issues of certification, language, etc. So would either of you like to make a comment about what that looks like in your experience?
Thank you, Susan. So indeed, as Fazli mentioned earlier, governments sometimes can be belligerent in supporting conflict-affected areas in the country and choose to focus in the more stable areas. But there are subtle ways that host government can be involved. For example, in South Sudan, the Ministry of Education actually co-chairs the cluster, the education cluster, and they attend all meetings and they bring in their inputs. And when we do collective assessments, they buy the results and they actually believe them. So that's one way of anchoring the activities of the education cluster with the ministry so that they can move that to the next level. Other areas could be the local education group that the government actually chairs as well. And so that helps to bring more and more work between the government, the host government, the partners, both civil society partners, local organizations, and donors to be able to work together to actually enhance collective outcomes, this irrespective of whether it's a humanitarian situation or it's a development situation.
Great, thanks, Jane. Did you have anything to add, Steph?
I did. Just in terms of thinking about this also along with the question on refugees in Cox's Bazar, that there's an issue of legitimacy too here that we tend to grapple with when it comes to host governments. Oftentimes there's a fear of resource envy when we get down to speaking with governments about how to serve refugees in their countries. So we want to make sure that the way that we frame any programming to government moving ahead is equitable as well as equal. So for instance, in Jordan, speaking about kindergarten for Syrian refugee children, a lot of, really geared towards PSS, no kindergarten in Jordan at that point. So that became sort of a countrywide thing, which isn't a bad thing, right? So there are all kinds of ways of manifesting programming for refugees and also assuaging any type of nervousness on the part of the host country with regard to excess resources for refugees. And it's also very sensitive in Lebanon along the lines of the Syrian refugees as well, given the history. So I think that's something to bear in mind as you're thinking about working with governments and noting that there will likely be sensitivities around that and being prepared to work with folks and bring them to the vision of what it would be to assist someone equitably versus dumping a ton of resources into a community that's just sort of arrived out of nowhere from the perspective of those governments. So that's all I have to add. Thank you, Susan.
Great, thank you both. I'd like to ask one last question that particularly to Fazle and Christian, from your perspective as donors, in terms of the role of financing, in terms of planning and coordination. You've heard throughout the presentations how central coordination and collective action is on response. And so when you're looking at investing and putting in funds on education in different countries, how much is there a focus on planning and coordination?
All right, shall I start,
Okay.
Christian?
Okay, please go ahead.
All right. No, that's a very good question. And you know that GP works through this local education group where we expect the coordination to happen. And when we at the Secretariat, we receive a plan or an application for a grant for supporting a program, we look at how the coordination took place. We look at whether the contextual elements are there in the application, and then we get into a conversation with the ministry and also with the grant agent who basically will manage our money in terms of addressing if we see there are gaps. So we have a quality assurance procedures that ensure that proper consultation, proper coordination has taken place on the ground. And at the same time, the financing is, I would say, optimal, not enough or not adequate, but sometimes, depending on the context, optimal for the program that is kind of requested for our grant. But at the same time, you said we are donors, we are global funds funded by donors. So there are other actors that are beyond our capacity, both as a kind of intermediary fund and also in countries. Sometimes we have to accept the realities in countries where coordination is not really happening very well. And then we have to kind of find a way, and we do find a way to support children, even in contexts where coordination is not optimal.
Great, thanks, Fazle. Unfortunately, Christian, I think we're going to have to close because it is we've hit our time on the webcast. Many thanks to everyone. I think this has been an incredibly rich discussion, and I think it will be continued as a discussion and an exploration in many quarters. So thank you, everyone. With that, we end the webcast.